Well, greetings everyone and welcome to the EKG case for the week of November 11th, 2013. This week, actually, we've got two cases that will hopefully represent something that is really, really important and somewhat cutting edge in emergency cardiology and emergency medicine. Some of you may know about this already if you've been keeping up with the EKG video series, but this is going to be some good stuff to review. Case number one was sent to us all the way from the United Arab Emirates by, and I hope I get this name right, Dr. Hirwa Kagabo. And he had a 28-year-old man that presented to the emergency department with what sounded and looked like reflux. This guy had already polished off an entire bottle of antacids with minimal relief, and I suppose that's why this guy came into the emergency department. And if you've been listening to the video series for any length of time, you probably know that one of the biggest red flags for acute myocardial infarction and death and malpractice is the word reflux, right? You never let somebody tell you that they have reflux, and you never let yourself call someone reflux unless you've really, really thought three times about the possibility of cardiac disease. Well, this guy's also got epigastric pain, and he's only 28 years old, for God's sake. So this is really, really a tough case to not call benign. But Dr. Kagabo was smart enough to go ahead and get a 12-lead EKG, a very reasonable thing to do, no matter what. After all, it's just a piece of paper and ink, right? It costs practically nothing, and it can give you life-saving information like it did in this case. So you're looking at this 12-lead EKG. There's clearly ST segment depressions in a lot of leads. Maybe some of the limb leads have some ST segment depression, and even more prominent is ST segment depression in V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. This is, well, quite simply, this is unstable angina. This guy's got diffuse anterior wall cardiac ischemia. What are you going to do with that? Piece of cake, right? You give him some aspirin. If you're a clopidogrel fan, you can go ahead and give him the clopidogrel. Give this guy some nitroglycerin and get him admitted to the intensive care unit, the CCU, or maybe even the step-down unit, and have cardiology see him maybe the next day. But there is something a little bit more going on with this particular patient. It wasn't just plain old ST segment depression in those leads, something a little bit more. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this case. The patient ended up having a positive troponin, mildly positive, and so Dr. Kagabo went ahead and activated the cath lab, whereupon this guy with just ST segment depressions had a 100% proximal LAD occlusion. Fortunately, this guy did well. He was discharged 4 days later, and the reason that he activated the cath lab emergently for somebody with ST depressions is because this guy has something a little bit more than just plain old ST segment depressions. He's got something that we now refer to as the dewinter T-wave morphology or pattern. So just to recap, when we first learned about this, it was 2008. Since then, there have been a couple of more studies that have come out. In fact, there's a brand new study that was published or is being published in American Journal of Emergency Medicine by one of the folks who actually sent his case in to this EKG video series. But anyway, the first article was in New England Journal. By the way, take a look at one of these authors. Wellens himself was one of the authors of this article, but is named after the first author, R.J. DeWinter. So these are called DeWinter T-waves. Anyway, what they described was 30 patients that presented with anterior wall myocardial infarctions, and these patients presented with 1 to 3 millimeters of ST segment depression, but with upsloping ST depression at the J point in the precordial lead. So let me see if I can draw this. So the patients had ST segment depression that sloped upwards, and then it shot up into tall symmetric, and I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but tall symmetric T waves. And with this ST segment depression, you'll notice that it was upsloping and it went off into these giant symmetric T waves in those precordial leads. And what they found was that these T waves, this pattern, the upsloping ST depression shooting up into tall symmetric T waves, was highly predictive of an acute occlusion of the proximal LAD, and that's to be contrasted with Wellens sign that we've talked about before. With Wellens sign, these are more subacute occlusions. So what we've said before is that if you see Wellens, oftentimes that occurs in patients that are asymptomatic, and those patients need to be managed aggressively, but not necessarily emergently. They don't need to go to the cath lab at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. They need to go to the cath lab, say, during this hospitalization. with the dewinter T waves, because these are acute occlusions, these patients probably should be going to the cath lab pretty darn quick. I'm not going to say immediately, although, well, that's what I would push for, and that's what more and more authors are pushing for. Send them to the cath lab, and there's increasing literature supporting the concept that this is practically a STEMI equivalent. When you see this 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, go ahead and activate your cath lab. And again, that's not part of the current national or international guidelines that I've been hearing about, but there's increasing literature supporting that. So let's go back and take a look at this EKG again. You've got a very classic tall symmetric T waves in those precordial leads. V4 is not that tall, but you see that upsloping ST segment depression in V2, V3, V4, and along with the J point depression. So that's a very classic pattern for the dewinter T wave. So when you see that, be worried about proximal LAD or critical occlusion in that LAD, either proximal or mid portion of the LAD. Now this is a diagram that is from that New England Journal article where they described a whole bunch of cases that they had, and you can see in every one of these examples in the mid precordial leads, you've got that. Let me just take this as an example. You've got that J point depression with upsloping ST depression shooting up into these tall T waves. And I'm not going to do this for every one of these patterns, but it's a very characteristic pattern that you see in all of these. And all of these patients ended up having acute proximal LAD occlusions. And because it's an acute occlusion, these patients are symptomatic. You don't want to wait 2, 3, 4 days during that hospitalization. You want to get these patients to the cath lab soon. Otherwise, they're going to go on to have an infarction. Case number 2 is sent to us from the University of New Mexico. Dr. France Doyle, who's an attending physician over there, one of the faculty members, sent this case to me, and he wanted to make sure that we credit the proper person. One of the residents, Dr. Greg Lamb, made the pickup in this diagnosis, or in this case. It was a 50-year-old male who presented to the emergency department with chest pain that woke him from sleep. They got a quick 12-lead EKG at 5:40 in the morning, and the person's already having a no-brainer, big-time anterior wall STEMI. Let there be no doubt, this is not pericarditis or early repolarization or reflux. This is the big bad one, right? So they went ahead and they activated the cath lab. Patient got aspirin, clopidogrel, nitroglycerin, heparin. The pain actually got better, and they repeated the 12 lead, which is fantastic. Whenever somebody's pain changes, always repeat the 12-lead EKG, because you might find something real interesting, and if you find something interesting, send it to me. And you'll probably do the patient good also, but definitely send these things to me. Anyway, here's the repeat 12-lead with decreased pain. Is 6:04 a.m., so maybe about 20-25 minutes after the initial EKG. The STEMI, the STE, is gone, but instead we now have the dewinter T waves. There's ST depression, which is upsloping in V3, V4, V5, shooting up into very nice classic tall symmetric T waves. So this was kind of a dewinter pattern in reverse, where the patient started out with the STEMI, and then as the patient's pain got better, the patient ended up evolving into the dewinter T wave. It doesn't matter which way it goes, whether you go from dewinter to STEMI or STEMI to dewinter. Either way, that patient's sick and has big badness in the LAD. In this particular case, the patient had 100% occluded mid-LAD and got a stent, but there was another part of the LAD that was 50% occluded, and a couple of other vessels that were partially or near totally occluded, and the patient had a troponin of 40. I don't know what the units are, but just as a general rule, anytime a troponin is 40, who cares what the units are? That's got to be bad, right? So anyway, let's just sum up what we've talked about with the dewinter T waves. When you see these dewinter T waves, again, you've got the QRS with J-point depression with upsloping ST segment elevation shooting up into a tall symmetric T wave. All right, and again, I've exaggerated that a little bit, but if you ever see that in the mid-precordial leads, you've got to worry. It ought to make you break out in a sweat, just like the patient. It's highly indicative of an acute LAD occlusion, usually proximal, and I'm going to circle the word acute. These patients are symptomatic. Unlike the Wellens patients who are usually asymptomatic, these patients are symptomatic. These patients are very unstable. These patients probably need to be treated immediately I'm going to say emergently. Wellens patients need to be treated urgently. These patients need to be treated emergently. Don't wait. And again, as I mentioned, there's increasing literature pushing for the dewinter T wave pattern to be considered a STEMI equivalent. All right, it's not in the national guidelines yet, but you'd be very justified in calling up your cardiologist, sending them these articles, and telling them that you've got a patient with a big-time LAD occlusion, and we'll see whether future literature pans out and does push this towards saying this is truly a STEMI equivalent and you should be activating your cath lab immediately. All right, so don't forget, dewinter T waves, be on the lookout for this, and if you see it, you've got to worry. Hope that was helpful, and I look forward to talking to all of you next week. Bye for now.